Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, herzlich willkommen hier in den Balloni-Hallen. Im Namen der Festivalleitung darf ich Sie ganz herzlich willkommen heißen zu unserem heutigen Silicon Valley Abend. Mein Name ist Kai Werntgen. Ich leite die Udo-Keller-Stiftung Forum Humanum in Hamburg, die als langjährige Unterstützerin und Mitermöglicherin der phil.cologne immer auch die Gelegenheit hat, einige Formatbausteine ins Programm einzubauen. Der heutige Abend ist ein solcher Programmbaustein. Und mit diesem Programmbaustein setzen wir eine Reihe fort, die wir schon seit einigen phil.colognes hier laufen haben. Das geht um den Komplex Silicon Valley. Heute Abend wollen wir aber die Reiserichtung, die Scheinwerfer ein wenig umhängen. Heute Abend wollen wir keine Reiseberichte hören. Wir wollen auch keine Selfie-Analysen vor den Tech-Konzernen mit frisch geputzten Turnschuhen hören. Wir wollen auch keine Feuilleton-Analysen aus dem alteuropäischen Feuilleton hören, sondern wir wollen heute Abend O-Töne hier auf die Bühne bringen. Biografisch legitimierte O-Töne, wenn Sie so wollen, kalifornische Tech-Street Credibility. Der eine, Philosoph, Philologe, Romanist, jüngster deutscher Professor der Nachkriegsgeschichte, der auf dem Höhepunkt seiner bundesdeutschen Karriere nach Stanford umzieht und dort plötzlich als Romanist, als Philosoph, als Liberal Arts Lehrer die Tech-Elite durch seine Seminare ziehen sieht. Und der andere, einer der Stanford-Studenten, der auf merkwürdige Weise dieses ganz berühmte Diktum von Karl Marx einzulösen beginnt, der morgens bis nachmittags durch die Classes in Stanford tingelt, der dann nach Feierabend ein Start-up betreut, in einer Größenordnung taxiert, die uns den Atem verschlägt und der dann noch theoretisiert, indem er bei unserem Lehrer, der heute bei Sepp Gumbrecht in den Klassen seine Lehrer verblüfft mit Heidegger-Exegesen, mit Nietzsche-Exegesen. Und mit diesen beiden Zeugen wollen wir heute Abend hineinzoomen in die kalifornische Tech-Mobilmachung, in das Zentrum rund um die kalifornische University of Stanford, gewissermaßen das real existierende Hogwarts der Tech-Offensive, wo die Zauberlehrer ihre Zauberlehrlinge fit machen für die Tech-Offensive. Und in diesem Sinne darf ich begrüßen Sepp Gumbrecht, Ginn und als dritten, den Moderator, haben wir das Glück. Wir haben lange gefahndet, wer könnte es hier in unserem alteuropäischen Diskurssystem mit ein bisschen Hogwarts-Spirit, mit ein bisschen wirklich Elan aufnehmen, mit dieser geballten kalifornischen Präsenz. Und da sind wir auf Armen Avanesian gekommen, der als Philosoph, als Autor im Dreieck zwischen Politik, Ästhetik und Philosophie sich in den letzten Jahren einen Namen gemacht hat, nicht zuletzt als Gesicht des sogenannten Akzelerationismus. In diesem Sinne, meine Damen und Herren, eine Woche nach dem Total-Zukunftsausfall im Fernsehtriell, wo Zukunft eine Nullstelle war, heute Abend hier mit einer Woche Verspätung, Ginn, Ulrich Gumbrecht und Armen Avanesian. Viel Spaß.
Der Lehrer und Produzent zuerst.
Ich glaube, ich sitze. Das ist meine Schuld, die Konfusion. Ich habe nervöserweise im Vorfeld ständig den Platz gewechselt. Ich hoffe, wir sitzen jetzt richtig. Guten Abend. Hello everybody, I'm very happy, excited and honored being here again, really excited in these days. Just being here present is already something special, and talking about thinking and living, one of the favorite hobbies of philosophers. And then thinking and living in Silicon Valley, really with the ideal two guests. It's a cliche to say that, but as you will soon hear and see, they are actually the ideal guests for this topic, thinking and living, and about the world spirit in Silicon Valley, living and thinking in the future mode or the future tense. It's the whole title. So we'll be talking about how Silicon Valley thinks, but not just that, but also not just what it's thinking about today, but how it is thinking about thinking, and other forms than our human thinking, artificial thinking, algorithmic thinking, and not just from a theoretical point of view, but as has already been mentioned, from a kind of concrete experience with people working in the Silicon Valley, in the surrounding for a long time now. Let me not forget, I nearly did, to have a special thanks to Tobias Bocke and Kai Werntgen for organizing all this, and me personally also to Luisa Ringel, who managed to get me here, which was not easy under these circumstances. I will only introduce the two guests very briefly, not because I'm a lazy moderator, but I thought of asking them to introduce each other as well, because one part of our conversation will also be the special relationship they have and what it means to work or study together in Stanford. Ulrich Gumbrecht, he's a German-American literary theorist whose works, books, and articles show an amazing range of interests, themes, and also historical periods in philosophy, semiotics, literary and cultural history. As we will discuss, he was, or as most of you know, for a long time he was known as our man in Stanford, and he still is Professor Emeritus in literature there. He had and has numerous, really uncountable visiting professorships, honorary doctorates, and so on. I will just mention one, which he's, as I know, especially proud of, and I think rightly so, namely that he's professor of Romance literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Just the number of books would take 10 minutes, which we don't have, but they are outside. Some of them, even his new one that just came out, I think, this week, and he will be signing some of them afterwards. The new one is on Province. We will talk about some others during our conversation.
If you want to, don't have to.
you don't have. If not, I will queue up. Next to me is Sam Ginn, who finished his college studies in 2019 with a BA in Stanford in computer science and comparative literature, which we will talk about. The interesting combination of the two. In the field of artificial intelligence and computer linguistics, his focus is especially on algorithmic understanding of language. And together with a fellow student, he founded already in 2017 a startup, Vetspire, offering products for veterinary medicine. We'll talk about it. A startup that he apparently just sold. I was asking the organizers to, instead of a honorarium, to get some shares, but I was sorry for the joke. I'm sure you get it often in Europe. As I already indicated, instead of even longer Baroque introduction, I really thought of being selfish and asking you about yourself. I start with you, Ulrich Gumbrecht. Who is Sam Ginn? How did you meet? How would you characterize?
I mean, I try not to be terribly professorial, but to describe how Sam and I met, you have to know something about American university that people normally don't know. I mean, you graduate from high school in America at age 18, normally. I mean, some people skip classes, they're younger. And then there are every year about, now it's 45,000 students who all have brilliant grades. If not, it's not worthwhile, who apply at Stanford. And they compete for 1,500 spots. So there are 4 years of college, freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior, and this is 6,000 students. Yeah? And to make it into this group of 1,500 is quite amazing. Once you go to college, however, and that's what most people don't really know, college is not, to use a German word, ein berufsorientiertes Studium. College is actually an American version of Studium Generale. You study everything, and you're obliged to study everything. And only starting in the 3rd and the 4th year, you create a certain focus. So Sam, for example, I mean, beside what he did himself, but from his classes, it was during the 3rd and the 4th year that he was concentrating more and more on computer science and on comparative literature. Now, this given, there is a job that's called pre-major advisor. So when these kids, as we are saying, these very young students, they're 17 or 18 years old. How old were you when you came to Stanford?
17.
Yeah, I think it was not even 18. It took us a long time till it was allowed in the US to drink a glass of wine for the first time because you have to be 21. So they are assigned a pre-major advisor. And a pre-major advisor is a faculty, a professor, normally from a discipline where this student will not likely specialize. So Sam hadn't said he's going to do computer science by any means, but from his profile, it was pretty much clear that he would not normally do humanities. So I became randomly his pre-major advisor. So I was a professor. Every year, I had 8 undergraduate students that I didn't choose, that Stanford chose. And my task was really to make sure that they use college as college. This is why they choose somebody who's not from the discipline that the student is likely to choose. So a computer scientist is more likely to have a philosopher or a historian or a literary critic like myself as a pre-major advisor. So I can still remember that morning, the beautiful office, and I started always at 8 o'clock, and I talked for 1 hour to each of them, for half an hour to each of them. So not like the German office hours, 10 minutes or just the signature, half an hour. And there was Sam. And for some reason, I mean, you know that from encounters, nothing special. I know this is an interesting guy. And the most interesting thing was actually in that conversation something that had absolutely nothing to do with intellectual life. I told them, so we're going to meet, I mean, I can talk to you individually, each of you, but we're going to meet as a group once every trimester. Stanford has a trimester system, 3-month, another semester system. And each trimester, I'm inviting the entire group for dinner. And you can choose, tell me what your favorite food is, and then we figure out, according to what the group prefers, we have Italian food, Japanese food, whatever. Not American food by any means. But anyway, and then Sam said, so what kind of restaurant are we going? And I said, okay, we go to California Avenue. It's upscale, good restaurants. I mean, like, let's say you pay $100 per person or so. I mean, Stanford would, of course, pay for that. And then Sam says, I'm really interested in food, and why can an institution which is as wealthy as Stanford, the endowment, the Stammkapital is $30 billion, Milliarden, why can they not invite us to a 3-star restaurant? And this is a strange guy. And is he joking? Is he trying me out? And then I realized that he was really interested in food as something aesthetic. Yeah, I said, that is interesting for a computer scientist, that food is so important to him. Okay, I mean, not long story short, I wanted to start with this story. I mean, we will talk about our relationship more, but it was a striking first encounter from the moment on that I realized this was not a joke. This was not a provocation, but he was really passionate. That's the word. And I mean, now we know. I mean, we have had tons of good dinners and expensive dinners. I mean, he made a reservation for Sunday when we're going to be in Zurich, in the Kronenhalle, for example, which some of you may know. And it's important to go to the Kronenhalle, not to another restaurant. But he was passionate about food. I mean, he doesn't look like he's passionate about food, but I swear, he was passionate about food, and that was the first moment of our encounter. Do you remember?
Yes, and Stanford still never paid for Manresa's dinner, so we're waiting for it.
That's the best 3-star restaurant in Silicon Valley. It's called Manresa. It's a Spanish town, a Catalan town. I mean, we have been going there, Sam and I, but no, Stanford never pays for Manresa.
I think Seb told me their limit was a 1-star. They would do that, but not a 3-star. But we'll get them eventually to do it.
So Nietzsche once said it only takes 3 anecdotes to characterize a person. There was one anecdote about you. Do you have a similar anecdote about Seb Gumbrecht that characterizes him, or what he means? What he means for not just for you, but like for your generation, or for people of your age and your interests that are not to become another humanities professor.
No, definitely. I think that was...
It doesn't need to be an anecdote. That was
I'll give you an anecdote. I think as Zepp was saying, like college in the United States is this very general activity. You're not supposed to specialize, you know, your first or second year, and you really want to learn and be exposed to everything. And so even so, somebody like me who might be excited about computer science or all these other things, they want you deliberately to engage with all that the university has to offer from the humanities or elsewhere. And that includes everything, including food. And so Zepp quickly became...
Zepp is me, by the way.
Yes, Professor Gumbrecht.
No, but I mean, it's not obvious. Somebody doesn't know me that my nickname is Zepp. So.
But,
it's Herr Professor Gumbrecht.
No,
But you're in Germany.
I mean, if you want to convince my American fellow citizens to pronounce Hans Ulrich correctly, you go a long way. So Sepp, you know, make a reservation and say Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht. That takes 3 hours. If they make a reservation Sepp, they always think it's Seth, the Jewish name, but anyway, it functions. So.
Well, he quickly became my teacher in many things, and so I think this is the most typical anecdote I can give, is that the very first time we came to Switzerland, which was several years ago, in the United States, as I was a student, I was under 21, so he wasn't allowed to take me out and drink, because then Stanford would be very upset. But once we were in Switzerland together, the law is a little bit different.
He was already 18.
And so Zepp quickly decided to teach me many ways, including in eau de vie, or kirsch. And so we had our first glass together. And I think, as with everything with Zepp, there's a focus on intensity of experience, or Zepp's word of creating a presence. And whether that's within the classroom when you're talking about Heidegger or reading literature, or even over dinner or not. And so we sit down at this bar, and there's nice comfy chairs, and I don't know very much of any German at all, and he has this very lengthy conversation with the bartender, of which they start laughing and talking, and I have no idea what's happening, and then they sit down and they bring over this tiny little glass, and then they start pouring this clear liquor in it, and then Zepp then proceeds very, very intensely to teach me what kirsch is, and what eau de vie is, and how it tastes, and what you do with it. And I learned very much from that one encounter about eau de vie, but also just about how to treat and live life. It's not something to just go by where you just eat when you're given food, or just a drink, or just when you're reading a piece of literature, whether it's Madame Bovary or some random best-selling novel. It's to treat every moment with that intensity, and to learn and as much as you can, not just for the sake of erudition. We were talking about Wikipedia now. You don't need to learn facts, but to learn how to appreciate it, whether that is alcohol, whether that's food, or whether that's literature, whether that's coding. And so in my very, very first encounter with Zepp, he was 100% right. It wasn't just an idle interest of how can I get Stanford to pay for the most expensive food possible, but how can you get Stanford to create the most intense type of experience possible? And they very much did, and then we continue with that. And so I think that is the best anecdote I can give about Professor Gumbrecht, is that every moment with him, you capture this intensity, and he forces you to become present in whatever it is that you're doing. And that's why, even though I probably didn't even know what the name Heidegger was, or half of the German authors or Spanish authors that Zepp has since introduced me to, he makes absolutely everything become so present and intense that you can't help but become interested in it, and then see how that can be applied to your life.
Now, we stop here. I think that's so beautiful.
Yeah, we get to Heidegger and less alcoholic topics. One thing you both mentioned is
alcohol.
This is water, by the way. It doesn't look like kirsch. Is an apparent paradox, or something counterintuitive, maybe for my old European ears. You literally said, I think you used the word of, you're not supposed to specialize. Now, one thing one associates with elite universities is the outstanding outcomes and products, that people really specialize on something and stand out and so on. And this is achieved, and here is the counterintuitive moment, by an approach of at least initially not specializing. Now, my question would be, in the end, how did you decide, which classes to visit, which courses to follow, which fields to approach, and to combine comparative literature and computer sciences, which is not a usual, at least for me, it's not a usual combination, but a kind of innovative choice?
No, 100%. And so actually, I don't think it was until probably late in my sophomore year, junior year, where I actually
when you have to decide what you major in.
and so when you first get to Stanford, I think you fill out like some form about like what you're interested in, and you list kind of your top things. But I actually wasn't originally going to major specifically, you know, in computer science or, you know, in comparative literature. And to be quite honest, I had no idea what comparative literature actually was, you know, coming into Stanford. And I think you just start getting exposed to various different things. And I actually never, I took one course actually specifically with Zepp, but only one. And despite, you know, all the influence. And I can remember, so during the first semester, you know, we all go out to dinners, part of the pre-major advisor activities. And at one of the dinners, Zepp invited me to come to this group called PRG, the Philosophical Reading Group. And I had no idea what it was, but it sounded interesting, and I love philosophy, and I love learning and talking. And so the first time I go, you know, you sit down and there's this room, it's after hours, it's like 6 p.m. at night, and then there's
You cannot get any credit, that's important. You go there. No
not
credit.
a class at all. You know, you're not graded, there's no homework, there's no credits. And you walk in and there's like 30 other graduate students and professors sitting around, and then they just...
And undergraduates, sorry, but that's...
Yes, and undergraduates.
Completely open.
And then they just talk for 2 hours intensely about philosophy. And very unlike any other kind of class at Stanford that I had taken, where the students are forced to be there, you know, where you have to engage them, ask them questions to start talking. You know, here was a group of people that just, you know, began as soon as it hit 6 o'clock. There would always be, Zepp would have somebody do a little kickoff, 10-minute kind of talk and opening, and then the discussion would just continue. And it was so intoxicating to be part of that kind of conversation, to delve deeply into something like that. And that's what got me so excited about comparative literature, because you read literature not just with the sense of, you know, what this author wrote or, you know, how this plot worked, but how does that literature inform the way in which you live life? And for me, that's what philosophy and comparative literature became, is, you know, I had no intention to get a PhD in it, but how can reading those works, how can debating with Zepp make me, one, a better person, and then two, also a better scholar, you know, in things like computer science and things like artificial intelligence, and how can you get that excitement?
I just want to, can I explain one institutional thing? It's boring, but it's important to understand. Philosophy departments in the UK and in America, predominantly, almost exclusively, focused on what is called analytic philosophy. I mean, if you don't know the name analytic philosophy, that's a philosophy that's very much oriented in formal logic and close to mathematics. The rest, I mean, what you normally associate with philosophy when you say philosophy in Germany or France, is called continental philosophy, for no reason. But comparative literature departments, at least when they are good, at the top universities in America, include continental philosophy. And while my training was really the one of a Literaturwissenschaftler, a literary critic, I would say over the 29 years that I was teaching in Stanford, I was probably teaching slightly more continental philosophy, never analytic philosophy, because I'm not good at it, than literature. So this is why Sam chose to be to minor, as you say, it was a second concentration in comparative literature, but I think his interest, I mean, not that he's not interested in literature, but it was more an interest in continental philosophy.
Oh, very much so. I mean, the philosophy department at Stanford is world-class, but they specialize in the analytic philosophy, very good at logic and things that you might actually think is more closely aligned with computer science. But at least to my imagination, far less interesting than kind of the questions that don't have such clear answers that Zepp and the other continental philosophers are engaging with.
Would you say that, from the point of view of the academic and the teacher, would you say, in knowing both the German system and the American system, is this a happy coincidence, or is it a systematic advantage of American universities, or at least the top universities, that they allow, or at least to make an effort of overcoming this distinction between the humanities and the tech world, or like I think in the Stanford jargon you call it the techies and the fuzzies, you know?
I mean, basically I have to say, I mean, you know, whenever you talk about America in general, yesterday I had a discussion with your Ethikrat-Vorsitzende about how Americans react to COVID, and that depends on the county, on the Regierungsbezirk you're living in. You cannot make a general statement, but you can make a general statement about the university system. I mean, America has normally 35 out of the top 50 universities in any ranking are American. That's true. I would also say the 2,000 absolutely worst universities in the world are American. I mean, that is also true. Whereas in Germany, there's a very good middle level. I mean, Germany has, by international standards, no university that's not good or okay, but it has no top university. There's very few rankings where there's any German university in the top 50. Okay, now the systematic thing is American universities, whether bad or good, they all start with college. And after college, you have to change the university, and then you can get a professional education. Then you can go to medical school, then you can go to law school, then you can get a PhD. I mean, Dr. Phil in the humanities, but you have to change university. And the point I want to make in answering your question, there is no American university that does not focus on college and that does not try today to counterbalance a certain tendency of Sam's generation to focus on one thing right from the start, so to anticipate professional education. I think even the colleges that are not so good, but as a general reaction, they really try to oblige you to not only do one thing. For example, I mean, I started with Romanistik and Germanistik, then I did philosophy and Catholic theology, but thank goodness I never had to do math because I'm horrible in math, in mathematics, yeah? But it would not have been possible for me to go to any college without doing math. I mean, and that's it's a very general thing. That is not exceptional. I think today there is a tension between the parents who pay Studiengebühren and the students who want to specialize very early. But I do think the institutions, bad or good, want them to have this Studium Generale.
And I'll add that I think it makes the student better, even if they're going to go off and specialize into something else. Like I, of course, then went off and didn't become a comparative literature PhD, but did computer science and AI. And I think 100%, studying philosophy and reading with Zepp and debating made me a better computer scientist and made me better at doing AI or better at working at the startup, far better than if that is all that I focused on. And so, we always hear this word like interdisciplinary, and I don't always like that because like you're not necessarily trying to combine the two disciplines and form one. There's like things like digital humanities and stuff, but that never interested me. What interests me is going deeply into philosophy and seeing how that can make you be a better computer scientist, or leveraging your knowledge of the science to make you be able to do the philosophy better.
That sounds like good, or like I'm happy to hear that, teaching philosophy, but I would be curious to hear more about it, or maybe you can explain it better, and especially with regards to the philosopher that actually is one of your favorites, or you became an expert of, and not just any philosopher, then Heidegger of all people, who's not just...
One has to mention Sam is from a Jewish family, so nevertheless he became a Heidegger fan.
Who not just has a very dubious political...
That's an anecdote. He shares the birthday with Adolf Hitler. His mother tried to avoid it.
I like to say I redeem the date for the world.
So... yeah, it's counterintuitive to say the least, not just for the political reasons and the historical reasons, but also Heidegger having a reputation as a technophobic thinker, to say the least. So how is it possible that not just philosophy makes you a better scientist because it's inspiring and opens your worldview and these kind of things, but really technically becoming a better coder, better in writing programs or algorithms by Heidegger? And those of you who ever read Heidegger will understand my question, or my astonishment, or my wondering.
I can give you a very, very clear kind of example to kind of exemplify it. So as you had mentioned, kind of where my specialty is in what's called natural language processing, or NLP. It's the specific branch of AI that focuses on how to understand language and how to generate language and communicate via language. And so in that field, kind of the very basics understanding of that field is all presupposed on the assumption that every single word in whatever language, universal, English, German, French, Arabic, can be represented by a specific vector of numbers. And so we call them like word vectors, for instance. So, the word apple can be represented by the numbers 1, 5, and 8, and the word pear can be represented by 9, 7, and 2. And so whenever the very first thing that an AI does in order to read, let's say, a paragraph that you wrote and try to understand, whether it had positive intent or negative intent, is to convert every single word into a vector of numbers and then run, addition, multiplication, subtraction on that to try to get, some meaning of whether this was a positive statement or a negative statement. And that underlines almost every single algorithm. But, if you read someone like Heidegger, when he's talking about things like meaning making or things like Stimmung or things where he talks about what it's like to actually understand something. So concepts like, he talks about this all the time of, a door handle. When you see a door handle just by itself, yes, it's a door handle, but until you actually want to open that door in your brain, it's not necessarily a door handle abstractly. It's something that opens that door for you. And so words and objects and things for Heidegger have this plurality of meanings, and they only take into effect when you walk into a room and have a purpose for something. He has the concept of, ready-at-handedness. And I think that by itself, just as a very specific example, contradicts kind of the very foundation of what we are using for NLP algorithms, that every single word can have a singular numerical representation. So the word hammer or the word door handle would always be represented by the exact same numbers, no matter what the context is. And you would try to encode all the various things by just a specific set of numbers. But I think just reading Heidegger kind of makes you think and attacks that, specific understanding, and then makes you want to generate different algorithms, or maybe words aren't represented by numerical vectors that remain static, but that can change over time. And actually just recently in 2017, there's kind of a new foundation of NLP using something called transformers, which does that specifically, that word vectors change in relationship to where their surroundings are. And that's done loads and loads better than kind of the previous algorithms that we had. And so I think this is just a long way to say that in AI, our goal is to create computers that understand the world and that are able to do so in ways that are similar to humans or even better than humans. And that is what philosophers like Heidegger and others have been doing for generations, and for millennia. And they've been debating amongst themselves, how does the brain come to make meaning in the world? How do we go about things? And we can leverage all of that knowledge, whether it's Aristotle or Nietzsche or Heidegger, to then inform the way we try to make computers learn. And they learn very differently than humans, but you can take a lot of those same concepts and apply it directly to making better algorithms.
We'll come to the question of computers and artificial thinking. I'm wondering, Gumbrecht, whether you think, is this something one can generalize? I mean, obviously, Heidegger is not the solution or the only thinker. You said that yourself. Could one generalize this explanation by Sam and say that the understanding of the history of ideas, of philosophy, philosophical concepts, is helpful for the development of new technologies, meaning that philosophy hasn't only got a kind of conservative role of confinement or just giving ethical advice or being a kind of meta reflection on things, but could have actually an active or productive role in the development of technology.
I would never go so far to say it necessarily happens. For example, if I would run a university, which God forbid, but I would not impose that all students in computer science, for example, would have to take philosophy classes. That would not really work. But, and that is a very interesting fact, I mean, we in comparative literature, more than in analytic philosophy, and you remember, I mean, it was like 5-6 years before Sam came to Stanford, we were all of a sudden appalled, almost surprised, by how many students from computer science, because we didn't think we had anything to offer for them, wanted to come, for example, to PRG, to the Philosophical Reading Group, or wanted to come to a seminar that I was teaching on the late Heidegger, wanted to come also to literature seminars. And then we talked to our colleagues in computer science, almost apologizing. We haven't lured them into comparative literature, something like that. And then they told us, I mean, A, that they really liked it. I mean, you know that they found it productive for them. But then they said, I mean, this is a word you don't use in Germany, but it's completely neutral in the US. Our elite students like to read philosophy. And if you offer classes that are interesting, we never taught classes exclusively for computer science students. That would be bad interdisciplinarity. But they like to do that because, and here's the point I'm making, some of them, not all of them, but for some of them, it does what you can describe. I mean, you can describe that in German too, but it's more current in English. It broadens your mind. I would not necessarily say that Sam, who's a very successful producer of code, Programmierer, could say the one thing that Heidegger helped him to do, as you could see from his example. But to read, for example, Heidegger, that could have been Hegel. This is not exclusively Heidegger. I think it has very little to do with Heidegger's technophobia, which, by the way, I doubt whether he had one, but that's a different question. That's not the point. But if you read Heidegger for the first time, I mean, you may, A, say, no, I'm not going to read that Nazi, and I would respect that. You may, B, say the language is so horrible, I think it's horrendous, that, you know, I mean, it kind of smells like sweat. I mean, you don't want to do that. But if you make it through Heidegger, and strangely, I find that the English translations are not bad and they're less sweaty. I mean, the German, for me, it's worse to read Heidegger in German in a way. If you make that, you will all of a sudden see, I will give you one example that is almost continuing what Sam was saying, that it produces a lot of what-if questions. For example, there's this famous sentence of Heidegger, language is the house of being. I mean, first of all, it sounds stupid, right? I mean, and being, of course, is really what Kant prohibited to talk about. It is the Ding an sich. So Heidegger, when he says language is the house of being, he is not saying, oh, the house has a window, and being, capital B, das Sein, always, oh, here I am, you know, here I'm showing myself to you. I think he means above all that being is hiding in language, that language may not be a way towards being, that, for example, being in a mood, being in a Stimmung, and precisely not to think actively may get you further with an intuition, with an epiphany, than trying very hard. Now, I'm not saying that Heidegger is right with that. Yes, I have a tendency, I mean, I share this impression. This is something that impressed me a lot. But that's not the important thing. The important thing is it broadens your mind. You all of a sudden say, wow, it doesn't really 100% convince me, but what if language is not a medium in which you reach truth, but it is a medium in which truth can hide, for example, you know? And I think, and this is not specific of Heidegger, I think this is specific of any great philosopher, and I would define by great philosopher a philosopher with a capacity of letting go. I mean, if a philosopher is somebody who wants to solve problems, he is, by my definition, almost always not a grand philosopher. I mean, this kind of, I mean, Hegel in that sense. Yeah? I mean, Hegel had this intuition about, you know, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and he pushed it indefinitely over 40 years. I'm not a great Hegel fan, but holy smokes, I mean, what he got out of it. I mean, if you read Hegel's Aesthetics, I mean, the number of pages were just astonished, is mind-boggling. And I think that effect is the effect that attracted and continues to attract elite students from engineering, from physics, from business also, from the law school to philosophy. Not interdisciplinarity, and above all, not courses, Philosophie für Anfänger aus Computer Science. That's an absolute no-no.
Because it's maybe one more question with regards to Heidegger, because it helps us then maybe afterwards talking about artificial intelligence, Silicon Valley. There is the language philosopher, not just a philosopher of language, but like really a philosophical treatment of language in Heidegger. You mentioned also, I mean, there's the ontology of Heidegger, the thinking about being. There's the phenomenological one, the hermeneutical one, that you also mentioned. For another important West Coast philosopher, Hubert Dreyfus, Heidegger was very important, but actually for opposite reasons, rather as a kind of criticism of standard or traditional ideas about artificial intelligence, because what he took out of Heidegger was exactly something you referred to, that all our thinking and existence is always context-bound. And that, according to Dreyfus, was in Berkeley, not in Stanford.
Nevertheless, a pretty good philosopher, although he was at Berkeley.
Even in Berkeley, that's generous of you. So you understand my question. Is there something particular about Heidegger as a tool to criticize standard understandings and traditional understandings of artificial intelligence, and to liberate it out of a certain ideology or of confinement?
Yeah, no, I think one, I agree with Sepp that it's not all philosophers, but many philosophers can be very directly applicable. And Heidegger, I think there is something specifically special about Heidegger that makes him attunely topical for kind of modern day artificial intelligence, because the whole goal of AI is to create this consciousness that can understand things. And I think that's also the heart at every question that Heidegger talks about, is what does it truly mean for a human being or for any being to move about this world and want or will or do or experience anything. And that's what we're trying to do in computer science, and specifically with AI. And I think a lot of, and this is what Heidegger did, he took Descartes and he said, Descartes' whole model of I think, therefore I am is wrong. And then, he tried to build on a whole foundation of a new philosophy and a new phenomenology after Descartes. And so I think you look at the AI world, and it went the exact opposite way. It took Descartes' statement, I think, therefore I am, and his whole philosophy and meditations, and said, all right, that's our foundation of AI, and let's build on top of that. And so I think that's what makes Heidegger very relevant, because he is directly critiquing the axioms at the heart of modern-day artificial intelligence. And where that's led us has been very successful. We've created very successful AI algorithms, but they've never been truly what we call artificial general intelligence. We've never gotten anything that's a truly general intelligence you can put on stage and it can talk intelligently about anything. It's always very specific AI so far. And so Hubert Dreyfus wrote a beautiful article, I forget when, called Computers Can't Think, and in order to fix them, it needs to become more Heideggerian. And I think that's exactly right, and that's why Heidegger becomes so relevant, because he's critiquing the exact same things that underpin modern-day AI, that every specific place of meaning, whether it's a word or an image, has a specific spot in this kind of Euclidean space of the digital realm. And that has been very successful, but Heidegger says that isn't how humans actually work and be. And so that makes you rethink, like, okay, if Heidegger is right, that then necessitates a whole different way of thinking about AI and a whole different set of foundations that may or may not be more successful, but at least they're different. And so that is interesting.
I mean, just for those of you who read Heidegger or not, it is quite interesting in that sense that Heidegger deliberately and actively avoids the word Bewusstsein. Yeah? I mean, if you read, I think that famously it comes up 2 times in the 400 pages of Being, Sein und Zeit. Yeah? And then later Heidegger doesn't come up at all. So that was deliberately, I mean, not because it had anything to do with artificial intelligence. That didn't exist. I mean, it died in 1976. This was before, I mean, the idea of artificial intelligence existed. But there is some, I mean, Heidegger is a counterintuitive philosopher. So if Descartes and Bewusstsein is the great established beginning of Western philosophy, then Heidegger will use pre-Socratics and could it not be completely different? And for me, it is more this impulse, what if? Could it not be completely different than something you can directly learn from Heidegger to then model something that is not Bewusstsein, according to Heidegger? I mean, at least, I mean, he has been, unfortunately, given his biography, very, very important for me. but it is much more by these impulses, these what-if moments, and I think this is true for many philosophers, than by saying, oh, now I copy Heidegger and now I finally know what's correct. Yeah? And it is my intuition, it is my observation that this is how, and we should not just talk about Heidegger, but this is how philosophy can have a strong impact on technology, and why I didn't understand it at the beginning, I now believe and I begin to understand why not only Sam Ginn is saying that reading philosophy, not exclusively Heidegger, makes him a better writer of code, makes him a better person working in artificial intelligence. And maybe, it would be beautiful, some of you begin to process that too now. It's very unlikely when you say it first, but if you listen to him, I find, I'll give you another, is it okay if I give one other example and know from Sam? I mean, Sam told me, if some of you must be able to write code, I'm absolutely not, that if you write code to achieve a goal, to solve a problem, you go nowhere. You go absolutely nowhere. I remember in a conversation about that, Sam said, you have to go like this, you have to let go, you have to let go, you have to go the next intuition, and then, says Sam, the problem is that my self-observation of what I'm doing, my asking the question, is this a right step or a wrong step, is always a fraction of a second or several seconds behind my intuitions. And he at first, he observed that it was never fully synchronized, but he thought it's maybe a bad thing. And then he came across the Heideggerian concept of Gelassenheit. Yeah, no, but Heidegger says for being to show itself, it's a completely different context, if you try too much, it will not show itself. You have to take a step back and be in the situation of Gelassenheit, which is not a guarantee that you will have a deep insight or an epiphany, but it makes it more likely. And that helped him in the sense that he did no longer feel badly about his self-observation and his intuitions not being synchronized, right? So this was not an intuition in that case from Heidegger, but there is no one algorithm or one truth or one argument that you can take from continental philosophy to do artificial intelligence, but it is very plausible, empirically, practically plausible to me that yes, it can make you a better person in artificial intelligence without making it necessary. No, you can of course be terrific in producing artificial intelligence without ever having read a line of philosophy. It's possible.
I think coding is often kind of misunderstood as something very similar to math, where you're given numbers and there's just a specific algorithm that you do to do addition or multiplication. Coding is much more similar to writing an essay, where your whole goal is to figure out how to model and expose and write about the relationships between data. And so, as Zeb said, I can type much faster than I can both speak and think. And so when you're typing and you're coding and you're writing, you're trying to form the relationships between different models of data very quickly and very fast, and figuring out, what is the right algorithm to do that. But you're almost just letting your hands and letting the way in which you code do that. And that's why we talk about them as programming languages, versus we never really use the word mathematical languages. It's mathematical symbols versus programming languages, because we use different languages for different things to describe the data that we're writing about. And I think knowing so much more about philosophy, whether it's Heidegger or Wittgenstein or anybody, gives you a larger vocabulary and a larger grammar in which to then write these languages. Just as knowing things about these philosophies and these philosophers makes you a better essayist when you're writing about, the COVID restrictions or anything else like that. And nobody would ever ask, does reading philosophy make you better think about COVID, ethical considerations? Because of course it does. And so I think the answer is, of course reading philosophy makes you a better writer of code, because it gives your whole mind, as Zepp was saying, these additional mental models to reason about things that you didn't have if you were purely just studying the math behind it.
There would be a lot to discuss, both in terms of philology of Heidegger. No? He himself had the intuition of cybernetics being a fundamental challenge to philosophy, and given our topic of the world spirit, that means is the world spirit even like still a philosophical? Is it still at home in philosophy or in technology and so on? So, Silicon Valley, you know, living and thinking in Silicon Valley is our topic. You gave us a very plastic idea, both of you, of what it means to study in Stanford, just glimpses, but nevertheless. Now, before we talk about Silicon Valley, more technical or hopefully also political dimensions of it, what is Silicon Valley? What is it like for you? How do people really actually live there? Where do they park the Teslas, obviously, and do they yoga? Or, but really, I kind of, what does it mean to work and live there? Is there something particular, or is it just like a lot of smart people who work a lot?
No, I think that there's something very specific about Silicon Valley, the place. That has nothing to do with its geography or how smart the people are.
It's not a valley. I mean, it's Ruhrgebiet in English is Ruhr Valley. It's a Gebiet. It's Silicon Gebiet. No? Very flat.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's very smart people, in Cologne and Berlin and Boston. But what's very unique about Silicon Valley, I think, is everyone is very focused on not necessarily technology problems, but world problems that can be solved with technology. And so if you go to any cafe, there's one on Stanford campus, called Coupa Cafe, but literally any cafe or bar or restaurant in Silicon Valley, almost every single conversation you will overhear will be about somebody's startup, about somebody's idea, about somebody raising money, and everybody is connected to that in some way or form. If you're a lawyer, you're a lawyer for startups. If you're marketing, you're doing marketing for startups. And everywhere you go, somebody's pitching their startup, somebody's doing this. And so it's almost this overwhelming, in this tiny little valley of everyone working on whatever it is that their business is or their problem is, or on technology or in some way. And so it's just this overarching presence, and it's people who are very amateurish. There's no professional, technologist. So there's no, body that says whether you can be a computer engineer or not, unlike, other types of engineering like structural engineering where you actually need to take tests before you can say you're an engineer. Anybody can do it. And so the phrase that I think most exemplifies Silicon Valley is, this phrase, nothing is impossible and everything is possible. And I think that those are two different phrases. And the first one means there is nothing that one cannot do. That you want to go to space, you want to go to Mars, nothing is impossible. And so the space of your ideas is limitless. You can take any risk whatsoever to be able to achieve anything. The second one is everything is possible, and I think that second turn of phrase is much more personal, saying I can literally do anything. There is no limitations to what I can do, and I can be the one to do it. And so if you're a young kid and you go to Silicon Valley and you say, I want to start a company, this is actually a friend of mine, I want to start a company that manufactures things in space. And this kid's young, he's like 20 or whatever, and it's kind of this crazy idea for somebody with no money and no background of building things in space to say, I want to start a company that manufactures things in space. It's never been done before. And he raised something like $25 million. And so a lot of people gave him a lot of money to do this absolutely crazy idea that will almost certainly fail. It's not really going to work. It's probably going to be very expensive. He's not going to have enough money, and he doesn't really know how to do it. But I think there is something special about Silicon Valley where somebody was willing to give him that large amount of money to try something crazy, knowing that 9 times out of 10, everyone fails to do it. But the special part is one time somebody will do it. Elon Musk did it when nobody thought he could, to build rockets that were cheaper to go to space and now go to the moon. And so there's that one person that might do that and be successful with that crazy idea, and you can never predict who it is. So you have to give everyone a fair chance.
What I'll say is quoting Elon Musk, and I come from a very different perspective. I say also when Elon Musk said you can create an electric car that's sexy, that's fast. I mean, you cannot. There's very low speed limit on American freeways, but nevertheless, and Tesla is a very sexy car, very good-looking car, and it's very fast. And that nobody's going to buy that. Yeah. And then he was saying, if you buy a Tesla, as long as you have the car, you can use a supercharger and don't pay. You don't pay gas, so to speak, for a Tesla. And everybody was saying he's going to go bankrupt in 3 months. And I was following the German media every day in the FAZ. There was an article. There was another Tesla that had an accident, as if the accident of a car would prove. But there is a Silicon Valley enthusiasm for crazy ideas. If you have a crazy idea, you're more likely to raise $25 million than if you have a plausible idea.
Oh, you go to a bank with a business plan that says, you know, here's why this business idea is not risky at all. I'm going to be very successful. That will much more win over the bank. If you show that to a VC, they're going to throw you out. They want to see a business plan that is super risky, that has basically no chance of success. But if it is successful, it can change the world. And that's specifically what the ideas they're looking for. They want people to fail. They want people to take risks. And if you do take a risk and fail, it's rewarded. You know, people don't say like, hey, you're a failure. You know, they say, oh, wow, what'd you learn from that? What's your next idea? And they specifically want those crazy, risky ideas.
Yeah, and that, I mean, okay, so, I mean, again, I mean, I'm terrible with business. I have no clue of technology. I can certainly not write code, et cetera, et cetera. And I do think, nevertheless, and this was just a lucky strike, I mean, my 29 years were pretty much the years of the rise, the 3 decades of the rise of Silicon Valley. I mean, we could talk about the history of Silicon Valley. What I want to say is that creates a climate that's contagious. I mean, for example, I mean, I don't want to brag about my books. That's a book you cannot buy today. It's not on the table for some reason, but I have a book that's called Production of Presence. That book was pretty successful. I will not say anything more, but it was quite successful. And I mean, while I am what Jürgen Habermas calls religiös unmusikalisch, I've always been fascinated for some reason, I don't know why, by Catholic theology. And those among you who are either Catholic or know something about Catholic theology know that there is this strange mythology and theology of Realpräsenz. So different from a Lutheran Mass, in the moment that a Catholic priest says, das ist mein Blut und das ist mein Fleisch, Christ's blood and Christ's body are really present on an altar. For a believing Catholic, I don't believe they are. But I was using this concept of real presence to say something about presence in the sense of stadiums, presence in the sense that we are missing now in COVID times. And when I submitted that book at Stanford University Press, which is bad taste, you don't do that at your own university press, but I did for some reason, you know, although I had been quite successful with other books, they said, if you don't remove this theological concept of real presence, we're not going to publish the book. And as I don't have to qualify anymore, I said, okay, if you want me to remove it, then I either move to another publisher or just don't publish it. Yeah? They ended up publishing it, and it became comparatively a huge success. And I mean, I cannot prove, but I'm absolutely certain that I would never have written that book had I not been in this proximity of Silicon Valley. I didn't think of Silicon. The books have nothing to do with Silicon Valley. What I want to say, this is what Sam was describing with everything is possible, nothing is impossible, is contagious. It's contagious, and this is not why Sam was interested in my stuff, but I want to say there's a spirit of this, you know, it's a stretch of 60 kilometers and 30 kilometers broad. It's very small. But there is a certain spirit. I would say not everybody at dinner in Silicon Valley talks about startups and technology. But yes, there is a difference. I think there are very few conversations where there's nothing at stake. For me, this at stakeness, in the sense of intensity, that's a descriptor of Silicon Valley. It may well be over now. I'm not saying it lasts forever and we are going to triumph, and I have my doubts whether it will resurrect after COVID. But there was a moment where this at-stakeness was so intense that I believe you could see it when you're walking by a restaurant. You could see it when you're looking into a classroom. It mattered. So we had these discussions in PRG, in the philosophical reading group. No credit, no nothing. But it mattered so enormously that you couldn't fall asleep after a PRG session, right? I mean, it was really, I mean, you know, I mean, okay, I can always fall asleep in the end, but especially listening to other persons. But in PRG, it was tough, and that is something of the atmosphere that's completely technology unrelated. I think the origin is technology and the risk-taking, but it became terribly important. I mean, you may know, if you're interested in philosophy, that the then leading American philosopher and one of the most important philosophers of the world, Richard Rorty, late in his career, came to Stanford, which was completely counterintuitive, because Stanford is basically a TU, not really, but I mean, it's not called TU, but it is something like the MIT. But he came to Stanford, this is how it comes to mind, because he said, I need, for the last 10, 15 years, that I will be able to write, I need a provoking, a stimulating environment. And indeed, he wrote probably his best book it's actually a book about America, Achieving Our Country. He wrote probably his best book in the last 5 years at Stanford.
No, I mean, I think Zeb's analogy to religious fervor is very much true to Silicon Valley. I mean, being inside of the Silicon Valley bubble, and I think it's very much a bubble, it's very cultish, because, you know, that mantra of nothing is impossible and everything is possible is obviously false. You know, like, it's just untrue. You know, there's always limitations to things.
Like real presence.
100%, but everybody is deluded into believing it's true. And so it's one of those statements that is just obviously false, but nobody in Silicon Valley believes that. And it's a delusion, but it is such an empowering delusion, because it makes you take those risks. And you take it with that religious fervor that what you're doing is very, very important. And so I think what Zep was just saying is very true, because even if you're working on some social media app, you know, or if you're working on, you know, a photo sharing app that might not be important on a global scale, to you and to the people around you, it is so important, and it matters so much.
I give you one example for fervor. This was a colloquium at Stanford with very important international humanities professors. One of them was my very good friend, maybe my favorite German colleague, or one of my favorite German colleagues, Horst Bredekamp, you know, the really, truly very, very important art historian and art theorist. And all of a sudden, to provoke, and in this fervor, Sam says, oh, I'm probably not going to die. He said, what? Bredekamp said, what are you saying? You're not going to die? I said, well, I mean, maybe it's possible to avoid death. Huh? And then Bredekamp really, I have to say that, wollte ihm an die Gurgel springen. He was getting up and going towards Sam, and then says, and by the way, poverty is completely unnecessary. And we can, I mean, and that's such a moment. In the moment, Sam, you are not thinking, oh, no. You are not only provoking, yeah? There is an intensity, there is a moment where you say something, then you look back, say, well, you know, poverty is probably difficult to solve, but something remains, some impulse, some energy remains. These are, again, so what-if moments. What if I don't die? Or what if it's not necessary to die? Yeah? I mean, it's an extreme moment, but by the reaction of Bredekamp, who loves Sam, but at this moment when he heard it, he couldn't stand the idea.
But that's why I think it's so infectious, because it is so much fun to think like that. You know, what if you don't need poverty? What if you don't need death? What if you can build whatever you want in space without any pollution? And those ideas, no matter how implausible, if you really do believe it's possible, why wouldn't you want to live in that delusional mentality? And, you know, 1 time out of 10, that idea is not delusional. And that's what then actually changes the world.
But I don't want to spoil the party. I appreciate your enthusiasm with diabolic questions like, where do the 25 million come from? People that don't pay taxes and therefore can just have their like joint venture capital and these kind of things. I'm rather like really historically. I'm curious, when does, you nearly called it a productive illusion. Everybody knows it's not true. I mean, ending poverty and going into space and so on are all the dreams. They have been tackled. Some things have even been achieved without Silicon Valley and so on. So it's not as if everyone waited for Silicon Valley, but not to undermine the idea, but what I'm interested in, when did this idea or this ideology, and I mean this not in a negative sense, consolidate itself? You know, this kind of post-68 hippie freedom idea, and then mixes up with
no, the drug culture was very important.
Yeah, combines with technology now. Maybe I start with asking you, and Ulrich Gumbrecht, because it's also a historical question. You mentioned that you started, I think you started in '89, no, at Stanford? 88, just to give you some dates, 88 is when Google was founded, no? So how did you witness the consolidation of Silicon Valley as a concept, as an idea, whether we like it or not? And did you only realize later, or did your opinion about it change, or were you from the beginning on? Did you get there's something different? And
I mean, there are two answers. The one I'm just saying it so that you know I know it. I mean, the name silicon comes from a certain type of old processor transistor computer where this material was used. So there was a name of Silicon Valley because there was a certain production side when they still produced the iPhones. I mean, no iPhone that you can ever buy is produced in Silicon Valley. I mean, there are people who think about the next generation of iPhones. Anyway, that's where the name comes from. I would definitely say, although the name Silicon Valley already existed, that when we came there in '89, Silicon Valley has not started. By the way, with which I don't want to say that I triggered Silicon Valley, obviously. But as you mentioned, I didn't know the exact date about the Google Foundation. Yeah? This is '88. I mean, the Google founders founded Google because they had an idea that they could produce a much more efficient search engine. They were not the inventors of the search engine. There were about 100 competing projects, many of them in India actually, about producing a search engine. But they, I mean, even I could explain what the specific thing was. But they believed they could create a much more efficient search engine, and that has profoundly changed our lives. And I would say the search engine and Google for one thing, and Apple. And I will give you an example with our friend Friedrich Kittler, who most of you know the name, or some of you know the name. I mean, the inventor really of media studies, a German colleague. It's the success of Apple. When I came to Silicon Valley, there were already these computers that looked like small TV screens. Yeah? There was the first Apple generation, Apple Macintosh. Mm-hmm. And then in the next generation, they invented the touch screen. And Friedrich Kittler said the touch screen is the end of the computer industry in California. It's a completely aberrant, actually, Zuhanden, this is interesting, ready to hand. It's completely aberrant, and it was bad taste. Nobody who was advanced with computation would buy an Apple. Whoever bought an Apple, and I think the rise of Google via search engine, and I would, as a hypothesis, as the rise almost to a monopoly. I mean, who does not use an iPhone today? I could tell you private stories about that, but I don't. Who does not use an iPhone today? With this Steve Jobs idea of being handy, something that has to fit in your hand, you really literally think of your iPhone, you have the whole world in your hand. That is no longer an attribution to God. So these two movements, I mean, that were of course intertwined, they made Silicon Valley. And it is well possible that now that we are at a time where there's the next iPhone, the next iPhone, the next iPhone, some are smaller, some are larger, some have a better camera, but there hasn't been any incisive breakthrough recently. It may well be the end. But I think these years, starting slowly in the 90s, accelerating about the change of the millennium, and then I would say the first and especially the first decade. I mean, I hadn't prepared this question, but from being there and also from feeling this infectious intensity, I would say it reached its peak 2005, 2010, the time when Stanford was still very strong. I have a feeling, maybe that has to do with the fact that I'm retired, it may no longer be so strong, but there was a time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what makes Silicon Valley, very distinctive is the idea of disruption. Silicon Valley is built upon startups disrupting bigger industries over and over. So, Apple disrupted, Microsoft and IBM, and then we had mobile phones, which then disrupted computers, and that then just continues. And then you had Google, which disrupted the earlier search engines. And so Silicon Valley is not a research center. It's not doing the basic research, very rarely. I mean, sometimes there is, but it's much more about doing things better and disrupting the existing. And so what Sepp just touched on at the end is very interesting, because Silicon Valley time and time again has disrupted itself, with various different technologies. And by doing that now, it almost has disrupted the idea of Silicon Valley, because you don't need to be in Silicon Valley to have conversations about technology anymore. As COVID has told us, we can all work remotely, I can be on my phone and talk to somebody in Shanghai, and Silicon Valley enabled that, and it's almost its own inventions are now threatening to disrupt the whole idea of Silicon Valley needing to be centered geographically in a single place anymore. And that, I think it's not a foregone conclusion that Silicon Valley continues there. The culture might, but it might not need to be geographically centered there.
You realize, there's an interesting paradox. The very locally centered technology of Silicon Valley, you could say, as a provocation, eliminates the necessity to be in the same space. And therefore eliminates, not only for Silicon Valley, but the necessity of being together. Clearly without that technology, humankind would not have survived COVID. At least, the consequence would have been much, much worse.
I want to go one step back, because back to this historical trajectory that you gave us somehow, that Silicon Valley might have peaked in the 2010s. Now your startup was initiated in 2017. So we hope that's still a peak, right? Maybe you can literally tell us a bit more, like what code did you write? What is the startup about? What is the business model? And in a way, as you just happen to sell it, right? Somehow it seems, maybe that's a cliche, but it seems to me that a kind of circle of a project, of a startup, has been fulfilled. No? As part of the success there of a startup is that it's sold at one point. Is that so? That maybe the story of your startup.
No, I think going off what Sepp said, Silicon Valley has definitely had eras in it. It started with the actual silicon and the hardware, and then it went into the internet startups. So you had things like Google being founded then, or Amazon being founded then, things moving into the internet and being websites. And then you had kind of in the Facebook was founded in 2005. You then had mobile startups, people taking advantage of people all now having computers in their pockets. That's when Uber became a thing, or DoorDash. And so that was 2010 through 2015. And then you kind of had then this latest batch of startups, which myself is included, is, all right, you invented you disrupted hardware, you disrupted the internet, and then you disrupted kind of the whole mobile usage. It's then this next batch of startups, which I think is probably since 2015, are how can you then take all this technology and disrupt regular business processes. So you're seeing a lot more startups tackling questions of, there's a great startup called Flexport that's building technology to more efficiently move ships across the world faster and connect different people who are running the ships with people needing to ship things. Or there's another giant startup called Workday that's just much more efficient human resources software and allowing things to be better there. And so the latest batch of startups are about making things more efficient with technology in actual actionable ways.
Can you describe your startup?
Yeah, and so that's what my startup is part of that next generation. We're not inventing anything novelly new in terms of hardware. We're making things more efficient. So specifically, the problem that I was dealing with is one in healthcare. Doctors today spend so much time staring at their computers and typing away. Whenever you go to a doctor's visit, and which I'm sure you all notice, the doctor literally spends so much of their time typing and documenting all their notes into the computer. The American Medical Association, they did a study in 2016 that found that for every hour that a doctor actually spent face-to-face with a patient, they spent an additional 2 hours on their computer typing away, which is ridiculous. That's 2/3 of a trained doctor's time being spent as a glorified typist rather than a doctor. And so that is kind of the crux of the problem that my startup tried to solve, which is called Vetspire, in not the human medicine space, but in the veterinary medicine space, which is just easier to get started in. How can we
less dangerous, of course. In the veterinary medicine, the risk is much lower. If a person dies, that's more dramatic than your pet dies.
It is much harder for us to build AI technology in human medicine because it's so much more regulated. But in veterinary medicine, there doesn't exist any regulation and doesn't exist any governing bodies. So we would be able to build AI and build tools for veterinarians that didn't need FDA approval or didn't need government regulation. Could be doing so on much more lower stakes, with animals. But it was the exact same problem. How can we make veterinarians more efficient? How can we make their time more useful? How can we make their lives better and give them the data? So my mother's actually a veterinarian veterinarian, and I would always hear her on the phone talking, with clients about, I just like this steroid better than this steroid for this specific dog. And she's older and so wise, and so had all that intuition built in, but she didn't have any evidence for that. Why steroid A is better than steroid B. But now that we have computers and we have technology, we can provide that evidence. We can see, for a patient that is suffering from leukemia that's ages 10 through 15 and also has a history of diabetes and is a specific breed, what specific drug works better, which might be counterintuitively. But we can now provide all this data in real time to the veterinarian so that they can make the most informed decisions and do so without needing to type and spend so much time, because we can just listen in on the conversation and write those notes for them, and provide them all that data rather than needing to read the textbooks to do so. And so that's specifically, the problem that my startup tackled. So what we built was an electronic health record. It's the exact software that a veterinarian uses to document everything about their cases, that they use to prescribe medications, that they use to order up labs, that they use to view diagnostics. It's that whole software suite that they literally use to run everything about their day and everything about their practice. And so we built that and disrupted, an industry that was using technology that was originally built in the 70s and 80s and had never really improved since. And so what we were able to build just on top of modern technology was such a night and day difference. And so a kid in, his Stanford dorm could program that on a computer, and then you'd have veterinarians, across the country and the world want to use it. And then you started getting
that was
traction.
Before you graduated from Stanford.
Yes, my junior year, I think, at Stanford is when I started it. And then, it started to get traction. You continue to grow and build. And then at some point, my day-to-day work shifts from actually writing the code and, actively building it to then growing the business and hiring people, hiring not just other coders.
You had like 40 people, right, when you started selling?
When I started?
No, when you started thinking about selling it.
Yeah, so I think when we were acquired just recently in April, I think there's 28. And so, you'd kind of grown, and hired more, and then not just all engineers, only a fraction or so. And then, because you need all these other organs of business, marketing, business managers, finance people. And now, I think the goal of every startup is to have an exit of some form, to turn that startup into something meaningful, whether that's getting acquired or going public, or doing something beyond, just continuing to grow the startup. And so for us, that was at the right point. We had kind of built the best thing in the market, at least in the United States, and then it kind of become, the fastest growing and, best software company out there. And we kind of achieved that goal of building that for the space and building that for the industry. And so it became the right moment, at least for us, to then, be acquired. And we weren't looking, we wasn't ever looking to sell specifically. Things like that just kind of happen. Somebody flies you down somewhere and says, here's an offer. Do you want to take it or not?
Can you extrapolate on this?
And now he can invite me for the Kirsch in Zurich when we go. Zurich the next time.
With the shares, I did.
We have actually changed hotels. I mean, if some of you know Zurich, he's staying at the Borolac this time, and I'm staying at the Kindley, which is a very nice hotel downtown. But that flight to Austin, Texas changed a lot in his life.
Because I think it has something to do with the living and thinking. Can you explain this exit? Because it sounds so natural, that the thing you want to do is exit. But is that so?
Yeah, I mean,
why not stay with it and
inherit it to your children?
Well, yeah, I mean, when you're building the startup, you're never quite thinking about the exit. And if you ask if a VC ever asks you, what do you want to do? If you answer the question with we want to get acquired, you're not going to get investment. Even if that's truly your inner expectation, it's very taboo to say you're just trying to get acquired, because they want you to build something great and build something good. But everybody knows you don't want to give it to your family. You're there to solve a specific problem, and you want to be successful at that. And it's never just to start a business for business sake. So I think that's where you get a lot of family businesses, is they just want to start a business and grow that business and then let your children take over, and the business becomes the goal in itself, the corporation, the company. For startups, you have to build a business to do what you're doing, but you're never doing it to build a business. You're doing it to solve a specific problem. And we did that. We were using the technology and using the business to tackle and make the lives of veterinarians better. And when it happened, I was this was during COVID, and we were acquired by actually one of our largest clients, and so they weren't actually, trying to acquire us. They were just our clients. So they sent, it's a very funny story. They sent a private jet to Chicago to pick me up because it was during COVID times, and they flew me down to Austin. And I was only supposed to be with them for a month, just working with them. And at the end of the month, they sat me down and said, hey, we like you so much, we want to acquire you. And that's then kind of where those conversations went. And so it's to be acquired, for a family business is almost a failure because you're not leaving anything over to the family. You're losing the business. But for a startup, it's a fine inflection point because then you're given even more resources and given even more capital and given even more people to then continue to achieve the goal. And it just helps accelerate. So for me, we call it an exit, but I'm not leaving. I'm still actively involved in the business and will still continue to be for several years. And it is continuing to just accelerate and accelerate. The acquiring company is able to just inject so much more, money and people and resources to continue to help you achieve that goal, which is helping veterinarians. It's not building a big business, it's helping the veterinarians, and whatever lets us do that.
What I wanted, to emphasize, I understand you right. At this point, he's obliged, I don't know how much money he got, but it must be a lot, from what I see. He's obliged for 4 or 5 years to work this transition now. Yeah? And then he's going to have tons of money, but it's not yet clear to him what the next step is going to be. Is he going to do another startup with a different problem? He could, for example, that's what he told me when we were talking last time, he probably gets enough money to have a lab, a group of people working on artificial intelligence, which I think is what he's most passionate about, for a lifetime. Yeah? That's enough money you can, and not to produce anything specific, just to see whether you can be the one that produces artificial intelligence. He could also, not likely that you're going to do it, but why not? Because you did humanities. He could also acquire a small museum. Yeah? For example, like a colleague at Stanford who died 2 years ago, Carl Chiorassi, he's the one who invented the birth control pill. There was a lot of money in inventing the birth control pill. And he had in his home, an apartment in San Francisco, the largest Paul Klee collection in the world. So you could, have the largest Franz Marc collection, German expressionist, or whatever, the largest Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock, I think that is even beyond your limits. But something like that. You get the point. There is no necessary continuity in his trajectory now, and that I find fascinating.
Well, I think an interesting thing about startup founders is they almost always become serial. Unlike I think other business owners or folks who want to work at something for 40 years, most startup founders then go on to start another startup or go on and start something else after that. It's kind of the serial desire to constantly be producing, constantly be trying to think about something new, rather than just settling down on a beach somewhere, which could be fun too.
It sounds like an addiction. No, I mean it. It sounds addictive, like a Sucht. A Suchtphenomenon. You cannot live without this trajectory. New trajectory. Well, we'll see whether you can resist the addiction.
I'll start painting. Maybe you can collect my. Unfortunately, I really have to skip the questions with regards to AI. Because we only have like 10 minutes or so, but I'm happy to invite myself next year, if you come again, to continue the conversation about AI, because I have the feeling that our conversation touched upon some also political and economical questions that I would like, as a kind of final round, like to address. What you're telling is a kind of success story. Now, and obviously there's reason to believe in that and support it and so on. I was really struck the last time I traveled to the US, California. It was like in July. So I go there regularly, but I felt like there's a certain shift, something changed. And I spoke with a lot of tech journalists and also people who worked at Google for like 15, 16, 17 years and so on. And all of a sudden they seemed to me highly skeptical. Where before they used to be absolute supporters of the free market and the best solutions will make their way. they sounded a bit like you, right? You come up with a great idea, someone will support it. You find your way. Someone will buy it because it makes sense. It's a product that will sell, and that basically helps the consumer. Now all of a sudden, and I'm not talking about lefty like intellectuals like me, but like old school Silicon Valley people are shouting, crying desperately for the state. We need regulations. It's the tech monopolies that are actually preventing the good ideas, good in the sense of helpful for the consumer to succeed. It's conglomerates, it's monopolies that we're building that avoid progress with all the political problems that implies. So. Did I speak to the wrong people? Am I under wrong suspicion? Did I only hear what I wanted to hear, or is Silicon Valley actually much more heterogeneous than maybe we discussed today? Just let me finish with the Google thing. No doubt that PageRank and some algorithms are absolutely amazing, but we also know like why at a certain point during the history of the company, they had to monetize. And that meant selling our data. So they invented a kind of business model that now is not just working for Google, but for Facebook and many others, that is maybe not really in my or you iPhone user interest. So I'm not doubting the technological genius of the Valley, but the 25 millions that you get, they come, with a certain request that they want money back and so on and so on. Yeah. Sorry for the long question, but I think for the final round, I wanted to bring that into the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an important nuance in kind of like the skepticism that you're seeing, which I think is real, is that it's not a skepticism about technology. It's that I think everyone is still very gung-ho and very positive about the role that technology can play in the future and battling things like climate change and other problems, or whatever it is. And so I think people have the equal fervor for technology, but I think they have a skepticism for the large companies that have grown to monopolize it, like Google and Facebook and others. So when I first got to Stanford, my freshman year, I would say the vast majority of seniors graduating that year, if you could say like, what's the biggest success you can do, it would be like, go work for Google or go work for Facebook or for one of the big tech companies, and they'd pay you very well, and it'd be a fun and very prestigious job. Now, and by the time I graduated, so just for a 4-year change, if you were to go work at Google or Facebook, it's kind of almost disappointing. Whereas before it was very prestigious, it's kind of now thought of, as like a fallback. You couldn't do something else. Now you're just going to go sell your soul to take a paycheck and not do something interesting. And I think that's very much harmed, Google and Facebook's recruiting practices. And so now they pay even more. And I think directly because of this problem, they used to not be able to pay. They didn't have to pay that much because people wanted to work for them. Now, the only reason people work for Google and Facebook is to collect the paycheck. And so they're paying salaries so much higher in order to convince people to join them. But what people want to do now is not avoid technology. They want to start startups. They want to start new technology companies that are going to make a difference, and they're still actively using technology to do that. And so I think that's kind of the rhetoric that you're seeing is we don't like big companies, whether they're tech companies or not, but we still very much have a faith in technology. And I think that is very homogenous across all of Silicon Valley, is technology is a solution to our problems. Whether it's climate change or whether it's poverty or whether it's something else, government can help be a vehicle to do that, but it's ultimately going to be a technological solution. But I think there is a huge growth in skepticism of, will the tech behemoths do that? Will the Google and the Facebooks and the Amazons of the world help foster that? Or are they now hindering that innovation, which I think you're seeing a lot. Google keeps on monopolizing certain industries. So now it is not, if you were trying to build a new search engine, it's almost impossible to do because Google has this huge monopoly. And that's very hard. And so that's where you start seeing technologists critiquing, the Google and Facebook as being anti-competitive, being so powerful and so big that they buy up any competition before they can be big. Or, they prevent competition in the first place.
Which contradicts the dynamic that you were in a very convincing way, praising, right?
I mean, just because that's unlikely, but basically things, especially in EU countries, that the wealthier people are, the more they are on the right. They want low taxes, they want to be completely independent, they want no state regulations. I mean, that is just on the map of electors, the deepest blue spot on the map of the US, blue in the sense of Democratic Party, and quote unquote within the Democratic Party left wing, is Silicon Valley. The only of the billionaires who has a name, a protagonist, Zuckerberg, Musk, the only one who was supporting Trump and the only one who is publicly a Republican, and I think he's a very intelligent guy and I like him, and not because he was supporting Trump, really not, is Peter Thiel, you know, a little bit unser Mann in Silicon Valley, who was barely born in Germany. I mean, he speaks German with a very heavy accent. It's not unser Mann in Silicon Valley. I mean, he is the absolute exception. So all of a sudden, and that is interesting, I would say, I explain you how I use the word, there's a certain social democratism that has broken out in Silicon Valley. I say social democratism in the sense that I think Angela Merkel was never a member of the SPD, but she was doing, and Germany, in what is dominating in the EU, is sozialdemokratische Politik. Yeah? I mean, the parties that people are saying, not AfD, not Die Linke, but everything in between, has this mentality. And I mean, it's obvious, it's not just my obsession, all of a sudden European politics have become a model for Silicon Valley people, for a Silicon Valley mentality. Monopoly all of a sudden is very evil. Yes, as you were saying, we want state regulations and we need it soon. You support Biden with this huge investment for Social Security in the US. I mean, whether it's good or bad is a different question. But this is relatively recent. I'm saying that because in many ways, especially in a country that has einen Ethikrat der Regierung, which is strange for me, but anyway, in a country that has einen Ethikrat, this is very positive. Yeah? I mean, they become closer to the European model. But, and I'm not saying that's the real thing, that's the tension really, I do think to a certain degree that it congests, verstopft, that intensity and that dynamics of Silicon Valley.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think...
Not in the sense that I'm saying this is a bad movement, not in the sense that no, they should vote Republican, but maybe that is the tension that is the very present. You know, this is September 2021 in Silicon Valley, and it could well be that either it diffuses, there's no central place, or some people, Sam was saying, next place could be Miami. Next place could also be Mumbai. You know that India is super productive in anything electronic. So, I mean, I'm not saying it has to be in the US, but this tension, which is interesting to observe, but creates a climate like what you were saying. You know, I'm not really part of what Silicon Valley is doing, but I'm living there, and I love to live there. And I don't feel that degree of intensity, also of infectious, contagious intensity that I still used to feel quite naturally, for example, when you graduate, and that's 2 years ago.
But let me just clarify. I mean, my question or my example was like breaking up, for example, in the US, AT&T did not mean the end of innovation in communication technology. On the contrary, so sometimes state regulation and breaking of monopolies is actually in favor of innovation. But
yes, of course,
as you really have to
sustain competition, that's the idea.
Exactly. There's something that you addressed that we could really use, take up as for the final round, and if possible, because it's an impossible question and impossible to answer. Where's the world spirit going, right? I mean, there's different options. It stays for a bit longer. I mean, it comes from Hegel, right? He was still able to see the world spirit on a horse riding. No, it was Napoleon, and most of you know it. That was around 1800. Now, many things happened in between. In the last 10, 20 years, that was a bit the working hypothesis of this evening. It was in Silicon Valley. Will it stay there? Does it even make sense to localize it anymore? You mentioned that somehow Silicon Valley undermined the whole idea of being in a certain place, or will it actually go to a different to a different area. It could be, and that's what a big geopolitical fight is going on actually these days. It could be China, not because China is more innovative, but because there's a different nexus between the state and the tech industry, so to say. You cannot answer it. The answer can only be wrong. And you have 30 seconds. What else can I offer you? What are your estimations or speculations about the future?
Yeah, I mean, if I had to speculate, I think Silicon Valley is becoming just silicon now. It has nothing to do with the geography, and it's becoming a digital place. And so it's moving into the land of remote. Mark Zuckerberg recently said, the future is the multiverse, which is just, the internet. All the communications are happening on the internet, and it doesn't really matter what specific place you're in anymore. I can be in Austin, Texas, and still talk to people in San Francisco and New York and Berlin all in the same day.
But you could not have a philosophy class in Stanford. Doesn't that contradict what you said at the beginning?
I think it lowers the intensity of any given moment, but it democratizes the participation. Because I also couldn't have the conversation at Stanford with the smartest philosopher in India because you're separated by such a great distance, but now we can zoom them into the room. And so maybe it's slightly less intense, but you can gain access to so much wider participation. People in Estonia can be building the best technology now, versus before they had to get visas to San Francisco in order to gain the attention of VCs or so. And so I think that I think it very much lowers, the actual presence or intensity of any given moment, but it so widely opens the participation and democratizes it across the world that you're just so many people who didn't even have access to that now can do that. Whether you're impoverished in India, the moment you get a laptop, you can do the exact same thing I did without ever needing to set foot in the United States. And so I think that's where you're seeing things. And you're seeing this, if you follow the money now, investments are far more international now. Even though the money still might be coming from America, it's investing in, startups coming out of India or Indonesia or Eastern Europe in a much higher rate than it used to be. And so I think Silicon Valley is kind of moving into this digital realm that they themselves created, and it's no longer locked to any geography.
Okay, another 30 seconds.
He had 1 minute 20, I was.
Well, I tell you what I don't want. I don't want this diffusion to happen. And not because I don't buy Sam's argument about democratizing, that is true. But I mean, okay, I'm 73 years old. I don't have that much time left. I think the diffusion is not going to happen during my lifetime anyway. But if I look back at my life, the moments that I really appreciated, the great moments, not only moments at Stanford, not only moments at Silicon Valley, were always bound to a place. As we are Nordrhein-Westfalen, I say, for example, as a BVB fan, absolutely die Süd in Dortmund. Yeah? I mean, and I mean it. I mean, this is a place that you cannot have remotely. You have to be on the Süd. Ja, erst Herr Watz gesagt, das ist zu gefährlich für Sie, Herr Professor. Ich gebe Ihnen Personenschutz. Und ich habe gesagt, wenn Sie mir Personenschutz geben, dann kriege ich auf die Fresse und zwar mit Recht. Ja? I mean, so I want this diffusion not to happen for something that I call an aesthetic reason, because I love these moments of intensity. And that's not only intellectual moments. Secondly, I do think that we might run a risk of losing the cutting-edge innovations, the really true innovations, if we diffuse everything. Yeah? I mean, after all, the Google founders, before they found Google and before they had the idea of this much more powerful search engine, they were students. They were in a very similar situation. They had some of the same professors that Sam had in computer science, and they also took philosophy classes in analytic philosophy. And then thirdly, if it moves, if it doesn't diffuse, I don't want it to move to China, because there's a certain thing in Germany is a little bit resentful. Wouldn't it be great if China overcame the US? Look at the German media. There's a little bit of kind of, isn't that cool? Because, after all, the Americans liberated us from Nazism. We will not forgive that. So I don't want it to move to China. And as you mean India, I mean, the Silicon Valley of Indians, a very productive, is Hyderabad. A completely chaotic 8 million city, not a pretty city. But, I mean, I happened to be teaching there, nothing that had to do with technology. it's a place I like. It's a place of intensity, and I do think it should move out of the US. I mean, as strangely patriotic I am as an American citizen, so I want Hyderabad.
Good a guess as any.
I can only thank both of you. I learned a lot, apart from everything you said, that I learned that I'm powerless against your optimism, and I won't fall asleep when, as long as you talk, both of you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to all of you listening, and please don't forget there are plenty of books that I, out of envy, did not mention by Ulrich Gumbrecht that are outside, and he will sign at least some of them. So thanks a lot, and stay healthy. See you next year.